The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the weathered porch of Eleanor May Patterson's farmhouse as she knelt among her prized red geraniums, carefully deadheading the spent blooms. At 65, her hands bore the calluses of decades of hard work, but they moved with gentle precision around the flowers that had become her only companions. The sound of gravel crunching under tires made her look up, shielding her eyes against the golden light filtering through the oak trees that lined her property. A sleek black sedan rolled to a stop in her driveway, looking as out of place in rural Millbrook Valley as a diamond in a coal bin. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as the driver's door opened and a tall, well-dressed man stepped out. Even after 20 years, even with the grey threading through his dark hair and the fine lines around his eyes, she would know that face anywhere. Her hand flew to her chest and she whispered, "Michael!" But her voice cracked with 2 decades of hurt and longing. Michael Patterson stood frozen beside his car, a wrapped gift box with a red ribbon clutched in his hands. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than his mother's monthly pension, and his Italian leather shoes gleamed despite the dust of the country road. For a moment that stretched like eternity, mother and son simply stared at each other across the expanse of overgrown lawn that separated them. Eleanor gripped the porch railing, her knuckles white against the peeling paint. Every instinct screamed at her to run down those steps and throw her arms around the boy she'd raised, the man she'd sacrificed everything for. But 20 years of silence had built walls around her heart, and she couldn't let them crumble so easily, not when doing so might destroy what little dignity she had left. Michael took a tentative step forward, then another, until he stood at the bottom of the porch steps. The gift box trembled slightly in his hands. "Mama," he said, his voice deeper now than she remembered, roughened by years and regret. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I had to come back." The words hung in the air between them like morning mist. Eleanor's eyes took in everything about him, the expensive watch on his wrist, the confident way he carried himself, the success written in every line of his tailored clothing. Her son had become everything she'd dreamed he could be when she worked double shifts at Murphy's Diner to pay for his college textbooks, when she patched the roof with her own hands to save money for his tuition. But he'd become it all without her. 20 years, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the evening chorus of crickets beginning their song. 20 years, Michael." He climbed the first step, then hesitated. I know I have no right to just show up here like this. But Mama, His voice broke, and for a moment she saw not the successful man in the expensive suit, but the scared boy who used to run to her when thunderstorms shook their little house. Eleanor looked at him standing there, gift in hand like some kind of peace offering, and felt her carefully constructed walls begin to crack. Against her better judgment, she stepped aside and nodded toward the front door. "I suppose you'd better come in then. No sense in giving Dorothy Henderson any more to talk about than she already has." The interior of the house told a story Michael wasn't prepared to read. The furniture he remembered from his childhood was still there, but it had aged along with his mother. The floral sofa now bore patches where the fabric had worn thin. The wooden coffee table showed water rings from countless glasses of sweet tea, and the wallpaper had faded from cheerful yellow to the color of old newspapers. But everything was spotlessly clean, smelling of lemon oil and lavender sachets. Just as he remembered, Michael stood awkwardly in the middle of the living room, still holding his gift, while Eleanor bustled toward the kitchen. "Sit yourself down," she called over her shoulder. "I'll make some tea." He settled onto the familiar sofa, setting the gift box carefully on the coffee table. His eyes roamed the room, taking inventory of 20 years of gentle decline. The family photos on the mantel stopped abruptly when he was 22. His college graduation picture was the last one that included him. After that, the photos showed only Eleanor, at church functions, community gatherings, always smiling but always alone. From the kitchen came the sounds of his childhood, the whistle of the old kettle, the clink of glasses, his mother's soft humming of hymns. But underneath it all was something new, a careful quietness that spoke of a woman who had learned to make do with less, to move gently through a house that had grown too large for one person. Eleanor returned, carrying a tray with 2 glasses of sweet tea and a small plate of store-bought cookies. Her hands shook almost imperceptibly as she set it down, and Michael noticed how thin she'd become, how the dress that had once fit her perfectly now hung loose around her shoulders. "I'm sorry about the cookies," she said, settling into her chair across from him. "I don't bake much anymore. Seems foolish to make a whole batch just for one person." Michael took a sip of the tea, exactly as sweet as he remembered, exactly the way she'd made it for him every day after school. "Mama, why haven't you answered my letters?" Eleanor's cup rattled against her saucer as she set it down too quickly. "What letters?" "I've written to you, called. I tried to visit once 5 years ago, but you'd moved and no one would tell me where." Michael leaned forward, searching her face. I thought maybe you didn't want to hear from me." "I haven't received any letters," Eleanor said quietly, but something in her eyes suggested otherwise. She stood abruptly and moved to the window, ostensibly to adjust the curtains, but really to avoid his gaze. "Now tell me about yourself. I can see you've done well." Michael wanted to press the issue of the letters, but the set of his mother's shoulders warned him off. Instead, he found himself talking about his architectural firm in Philadelphia, about the buildings he'd designed, the awards he'd won. But with each achievement he shared, Eleanor seemed to grow smaller, more distant. "I always knew you'd make something of yourself," she said, still facing the window. "That's all I ever wanted." Through the lace curtains, Michael could see their neighbor Dorothy Henderson standing at her kitchen window. Phone pressed to her ear, her sharp eyes fixed on Eleanor's house. He remembered Dorothy well, the town's unofficial news service, always ready with an opinion and a side of judgment. As if summoned by his thoughts, Dorothy's voice carried across the yards. Eleanor Patterson, I see you have company." Eleanor's shoulders tensed, but she waved politely through the window. Within minutes, Dorothy's phone network would have the entire town buzzing with the news of Michael's return. Eleanor turned back to him, her face resigned. "I suppose I should warn you," she said. "People talk in small towns. They'll have plenty to say about you coming back after all this time." Michael stood and walked to where his mother stood by the window. Up close, he could see the worry lines that hadn't been there when he left, the way she held herself as if she were carrying an invisible weight. "Let them talk, Mama. I don't care what they think." "Well, I do," Eleanor said sharply, then softened her tone. "I've had to live with their opinions for 20 years. Their pity, their questions about why my successful son never comes to see his poor old mother." The words hit Michael like a physical blow. He reached out to touch her arm, but she stepped away, moving toward the kitchen. As she did, she knocked over her teacup, sending it crashing to the floor in a shower of glass and amber liquid. "Oh, for heaven's sake!" Eleanor exclaimed, immediately dropping to her knees to clean up the mess. Michael moved to help her, kneeling beside her on the worn linoleum. As he reached for a particularly large piece of glass, his eyes caught sight of something tucked under a kitchen towel on the counter, the corner of what looked like official papers. Past due notices in red ink, visible even from where he knelt. Eleanor followed his gaze and quickly stood, moving to block his view of the counter. "I can manage this myself," she said, her voice tight with embarrassment and something that might have been panic. But Michael had seen enough. The careful way his mother rationed sugar in her tea, the store-bought cookies instead of her legendary homemade ones, the patches on the furniture, the bills hidden under towels. It all painted a picture he didn't want to believe. As the evening shadows lengthened and Michael prepared to leave for the Millbrook Motor Lodge, Dorothy Henderson appeared at the front gate, as if she'd been lying in wait. She carried an empty pie plate and wore the expression of someone who had news to deliver, whether it was wanted or not. "Eleanor." "Dear?" Dorothy called sweetly, latching and unlatching the gate in a nervous gesture. "I just wanted to return your pie plate from the church social last month." Eleanor stepped out onto the porch, Michael close behind her. "Thank you, Dorothy. That was thoughtful of you." Dorothy's sharp eyes took in every detail of Michael's appearance, from his expensive clothes to his luxury car. "And this must be your Michael. Why haven't you done well for yourself? We heard you were some kind of big-shot architect up in Philadelphia." "Something like that," Michael replied carefully, recognizing the predatory gleam in the older woman's eyes. "Well, isn't that nice?" Dorothy continued, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Though I have to say, some people in town have wondered why a successful man like yourself would let his poor mother struggle all by herself, living in this old house, getting by on just her social security." She paused dramatically. "Of course, we all know about the foreclosure notice, Eleanor. The whole town's been wondering what you'll do." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Eleanor's face went white as fresh snow, and she gripped the porch railing so tightly her knuckles looked ready to snap. Michael felt the blood drain from his own face as Dorothy's revelation hit him with the force of a freight train. "Foreclosure?" Michael's voice was barely above a whisper. Dorothy's eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of someone who had just delivered the most devastating piece of gossip of her career. "Oh my, Eleanor didn't tell you." "The bank's been very patient, but even Frank Garrison can't hold them off forever. 2 weeks, I heard." "Maybe less." Eleanor finally found her voice, though it trembled like autumn leaves in a storm. "Dorothy Henderson, you have no business spreading my private affairs around this town like butter on bread." "Private?" Dorothy's eyebrows shot up toward her gray hairline. "Honey, when the bank puts a notice in the county records, it stops being private. Besides, we're all just concerned about you, living out here all alone, barely getting by on that tiny social security check." Michael stepped forward, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. "Mrs. Henderson, I think it's time for you to go home." Dorothy's smile faltered at the ice in his voice, but she wasn't done stirring the pot. "Well, of course, now that you're back, I'm sure everything will work out just fine. Though some folks might wonder why it took 20 years and a foreclosure notice to bring you home." She turned on her heel and marched back toward her house, calling over her shoulder. "Welcome back to Millbrook Valley, Michael. I do hope you'll be staying this time." Eleanor and Michael stood in stunned silence until Dorothy's front door slammed shut with unnecessary force. Then Eleanor turned and walked back into the house without a word, leaving Michael to follow or not as he chose. He found her in the kitchen, standing with her back to him, staring out the window at nothing. "Mama," he said gently, "we need to talk about this." "There's nothing to talk about." Eleanor's voice was flat, defeated. "I've managed my own affairs for 65 years. I'll figure something out." "Figure what out?" "You're about to lose your home." Eleanor whirled around, her eyes blazing with the pride that had sustained her through 2 decades of loneliness. "This is exactly why I didn't want you to know. I won't be your burden, Michael. I won't be some pathetic old woman you have to rescue." Michael ran his hands through his hair, a gesture Eleanor remembered from his childhood when he was frustrated beyond words. "You're not a burden. You're my mother. And if you're in trouble, then we'll face it together." Together. Eleanor's laugh was bitter as black coffee. "Where was together when I was working 16-hour days to keep this place? Where was together when I had to choose between fixing the roof or buying groceries? You made your choice 20 years ago, son. You chose your career over your family." The accusation hit Michael like a physical blow, but underneath his hurt, he felt a growing suspicion that there were pieces of this story he didn't understand. "What about the letters, Mama? The money I tried to send?" Eleanor's face went carefully blank. "I told you I never received any letters. That's impossible. I've been writing to you for 15 years. I sent checks, photographs, updates about my life. I even hired a private investigator to find you when you moved from the old house on Elm Street." Something flickered in Eleanor's eyes, a flash of guilt so quick Michael almost missed it. She turned away from him again, busying herself with wiping down counters that were already spotless. "Maybe they got lost in the mail," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Michael studied his mother's rigid posture, the careful way she avoided his eyes, and suddenly understood. "You did get them, didn't you? You got every single letter and you sent them back unopened." Eleanor's shoulders sagged, as if the weight of 20 years of deception had finally become too much to bear. "I was angry," she whispered. "So angry and so hurt. When you left for Philadelphia and never looked back, never called, never came home for Christmas or my birthday, or when I had to sell the farm and move into town. But I did try to come back. I called the diner where you worked, but they said you'd quit. I went to the old house, but strangers were living there. I searched for months before I found your new address." Eleanor sank into a kitchen chair, looking older than her 65 years. "I was too proud, too stubborn. By the time I realized what a fool I was being, too much time had passed. How do you explain 20 years of silence?" Michael knelt beside his mother's chair, taking her work-worn hands in his. "You don't explain it, Mama, you just start over." For a moment, mother and son sat in the quiet kitchen, 20 years of misunderstanding hanging between them like a bridge neither knew how to cross. Then Eleanor pulled her hands free and stood up, that familiar wall of pride sliding back into place. "It doesn't matter now anyway. What's done is done. You have your life in Philadelphia, and I have mine here, such as it is." The next morning, Michael drove through downtown Millbrook Valley, past Murphy's Diner, where his mother had worked all those years, past the elementary school, where she'd attended every parent-teacher conference alone, past the church where she'd sat in the same pew every Sunday, watching other families gather while she remained isolated by her own stubborn pride. The First National Bank of Millbrook Valley sat on the corner of Main and Sycamore, a solid brick building that had weathered nearly a century of the town's financial ups and downs. Michael parked his sedan between two pickup trucks and walked through the heavy glass doors, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the polished marble floor. Frank Garrison looked up from his desk as Michael approached, and his weathered face broke into a cautious smile. Frank had been a fixture at the bank for 30 years, had known Michael since he was a boy, coming in with his mother to deposit her tips from the diner. "Michael Patterson, I heard you were back in town." Frank stood and extended his hand. "I wish it were under better circumstances." Michael shook the banker's hand, noting the genuine warmth in the older man's eyes. "Mr. Garrison, I need to know the truth about my mother's situation." Frank gestured to the chair across from his desk, then closed his office door before settling back into his own seat. "It's not good, Michael. Eleanor's been behind on her mortgage payments for 6 months. We've tried to work with her, extend payment deadlines, reduce the monthly amount, but she's just too proud to accept help." "How much does she owe?" Frank opened a file folder and studied the papers inside. "Total outstanding balance is $43,000. She's been living on $800 a month Social Security, trying to make a $400 house payment, plus utilities, groceries, medical expenses." He shook his head sadly. "It's just not mathematically possible." Michael pulled out his checkbook. "I'll pay it. All of it today." "Hold on there, son." Frank held up his hand. "It's not that simple. Eleanor specifically instructed us never to accept payment from anyone else on her account. She made us promise that if anyone claiming to be her family tried to help, we were to refuse. That's ridiculous. She's my mother." Frank leaned back in his chair, studying Michael with eyes that had seen decades of family drama play out across his desk. "Michael, there's something else you should know. Something that might help you understand why your mother is so determined to handle this alone." He opened another file and pulled out a document that made Michael's blood run cold. It was a loan application dated 15 years ago, signed in his mother's careful handwriting. The reason for the loan was listed in stark black letters: final semester tuition for son's architectural degree. Michael stared at the paper, feeling sick. "She took out a second mortgage to pay for my education." $25,000. Frank confirmed. "She never told you, did she? She was so proud when you graduated. Kept telling everyone in town how her boy was going to be a famous architect. She never mentioned that paying for that last semester nearly broke her financially." Michael's hands trembled as he held the loan document. All those years, he'd wondered how his mother had managed to scrape together the money for his final tuition payment. All the times he'd asked and she'd just smiled and said she'd found a way. She'd mortgaged her future for his dreams. "Mr. Garrison," Michael said quietly, "I don't care what instructions my mother gave you. I'm paying this debt today, all of it." Frank studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I'll need some paperwork signed. And Michael, when Eleanor finds out what you've done, she's going to be madder than a wet hen in a thunderstorm." "Let me worry about my mother," Michael replied. But even as he said it, he wondered if Eleanor would ever forgive him for taking away the last shred of independence she had left. Michael drove back to Eleanor's house with his heart pounding and a receipt for $43,000 tucked in his wallet. He found her in the garden, viciously deadheading her geraniums as if they had personally offended her. The afternoon sun caught the silver in her hair, and for a moment she looked fragile as spun glass. "Mama, we need to talk." Eleanor didn't look up from her flowers. "If it's about money, I don't want to hear it. It's about the letters. And the loan you took out for my education." Now she straightened, her pruning shears frozen in mid-cut. "I don't know what you're talking about." Michael pulled out the loan documents Frank had given him. Second mortgage, $25,000, dated 15 years ago. Purpose, final semester tuition for architectural degree. Eleanor's face went through a dozen emotions before settling on weary resignation. "Frank Garrison talks too much. Why didn't you tell me? All those years I wondered how you'd managed to come up with that money, and you just said you'd found a way." "Because it was my job to find a way." Eleanor's voice was fierce with maternal pride. "You were so close to graduating, and that scholarship fell through, and I couldn't bear to watch you give up on your dreams because of money." Michael felt tears pricking his eyes. "But Mama, you sacrificed your own security for my education. You've been paying for my success for 15 years, and I'd do it again," Eleanor said simply. "That's what mothers do." They stood facing each other across the garden, 20 years of misunderstanding finally laid bare between them. Michael reached into his jacket and pulled out his checkbook, tearing out a check he'd already written. "I paid off the mortgage today," he said quietly. "All of it." Eleanor stared at the cancelled loan documents in his hand, her face cycling through shock, relief, and then blazing fury. "You had no right." "No right at all." "I had every right. I'm your son. You're a stranger." The words exploded from her like a dam bursting. "You walked back into my life after 20 years with your fancy clothes and your expensive car, throwing money around like some kind of savior. Well, I don't need saving, and I certainly don't need charity from someone who couldn't be bothered to visit his own mother." The pain in her voice cut through Michael like a blade. "I tried to visit. I tried to call, to write. Too little, too late," Eleanor snapped, but her voice was breaking. "Do you have any idea what it's been like? 20 years of people in this town looking at me with pity, wondering what kind of mother raises a son who abandons her. 20 years of sitting alone in church while other families gathered together. 20 years of pretending I didn't care, that my only child had forgotten I existed." Michael stepped toward her, but she backed away, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Mama, please, no!" Eleanor's voice cracked like a whip. "You don't get to waltz back in here and fix everything with money. Some things can't be bought, Michael. Some wounds don't heal just because you finally decided to come home." She turned and ran toward the house, leaving Michael standing alone among her beloved geraniums. He heard the front door slam, then the sound of the lock turning. For the first time in 20 years, Eleanor Patterson had locked him out of her life again. But this time, Michael wasn't walking away. He spent the night in his car in her driveway, unwilling to leave her alone with her pain. As dawn broke over Millbrook Valley, he saw Eleanor's face appear briefly at her bedroom window before disappearing behind the curtains. By 7 in the morning, Dorothy Henderson was at her kitchen window with a cup of coffee and her phone, no doubt reporting to the entire town that Eleanor, Patterson's prodigal son, was camped out in her driveway. Like some kind of vagrant, Michael was stretching the kinks out of his back when he heard the front door open. Eleanor appeared on the porch wearing her church dress and carrying her purse, her face set in lines of grim determination. "Move your car," she said without looking at him. "I have errands to run. Mama, please. Just talk to me. There's nothing left to say." Eleanor's voice was hollow, emotionless. "You've done your duty. You've paid the debt. Your conscience can be clear." She walked past him toward town, her spine rigid with wounded pride. Michael watched her go, feeling more helpless than he had since he was 8 years old, and his father had walked out on them both. That's when he noticed Eleanor's unsteady gait, the way she paused to catch her breath after only a few steps. Something was wrong. He followed her at a distance, watching as she stopped 3 times to rest on her walk to town. By the time she reached Main Street, her face was pale and drawn with exhaustion. At the post office, she swayed on her feet while talking to the clerk. Michael was out of his car and running before Eleanor hit the sidewalk. She collapsed outside Murphy's diner, the same place where she'd worked for 15 years to pay for his education. Michael gathered her in his arms, her body frighteningly light, and carried her to his car while concerned townspeople gathered around. At Millbrook Valley Community Hospital, Dr. Sarah Chen delivered the diagnosis with gentle efficiency. "Severe dehydration and malnutrition," she told Michael, as Eleanor slept in the hospital bed, looking small and frail against the white sheets. When did she last have a proper meal? Michael realized with horror that he didn't know. "She's been living on Social Security, trying to make ends meet. I think she's been skipping meals to pay bills." Dr. Chen's expression was grave. "Mr. Patterson, your mother has been slowly starving herself. Her body is running on empty. If you hadn't brought her in today." She didn't finish the sentence, but Michael understood. He pulled a chair close to Eleanor's bedside and took her thin hand in his. Her fingers were cold, fragile as bird bones. All those years he'd built beautiful buildings, creating monuments to his success, while his mother wasted away in quiet desperation. "I'm sorry, Mama," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." Eleanor's eyes fluttered open, focusing slowly on his face. "Michael, I'm here, Mama. I'm not going anywhere. You should go back to Philadelphia, back to your important buildings and your important life." Michael squeezed her hand gently. "My most important job is right here, taking care of the woman who sacrificed everything for my success. I was so proud of my buildings, but they're just steel and glass. You built something much more important. You built me, and I failed you." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "I was so proud of you, son. Even when I was angry, even when I sent back your letters, I was proud. I just didn't know how to let you help me. I'd been taking care of myself for so long, I forgot how to be taken care of." "Then it's time you learned," Michael said softly. Word of Eleanor's collapse spread through Millbrook Valley faster than wildfire in August. By evening, a steady stream of visitors began arriving at the hospital. Mrs. Murphy from the diner brought homemade soup. The Methodist church ladies came with flowers and prayers. Even Dorothy Henderson appeared, clutching a casserole and looking genuinely contrite. "Eleanor, honey," Dorothy said, her usual sharp tongue softened by genuine concern. "I owe you an apology. I had no business spreading your private affairs around town. We all knew you were struggling, but instead of helping, we just talked. That was wrong of us." Eleanor reached out and took Dorothy's hand. "We all make mistakes, Dorothy. What matters is that we learn from them." Frank Garrison arrived with news that made Eleanor's eyes widen. "The whole town's been talking about what you did for your mother, Michael. Folks are impressed. Tom Bradley at the hardware store mentioned they could use an architect to help redesign Main Street, make it more welcoming for tourists. And the county's been looking for someone to design a new community center." Michael looked at Eleanor, then back at Frank. "I'm thinking about opening a practice here in Millbrook Valley. If there's enough work to sustain it, are you serious?" Eleanor's voice was barely a whisper. "Dead serious. I've spent 20 years building monuments to my own ego. It's time I started building something that matters, a life with my family, in the community that shaped me." 6 months later, Eleanor Patterson sat on her beautifully restored front porch, watching her son work in the garden he'd planted especially for her. The house had been renovated with love and respect for its history. The sagging porch reinforced and painted, the roof replaced, the interior updated while preserving its homey charm. Michael looked up from the tomato plants he was staking and grinned at her. "Remember when you used to make me weed this garden as punishment? And now you're doing it voluntarily," Eleanor laughed. Who would have thought? The sound of her laughter still amazed him. For months after her hospitalization, she'd been so fragile, so careful, as if she were afraid to fully trust this second chance they'd been given. But gradually, as Michael proved his commitment by actions rather than words, she'd begun to bloom again like flowers after rain. The mail truck rumbled up the driveway, and carrier Jenny Walsh waved cheerfully as she stuffed letters into the mailbox. "Afternoon, Mrs. Patterson. Looks like Mike's got more business coming in." Eleanor walked down to collect the mail, her steps steady and sure now that proper nutrition and peace of mind had restored her strength. Among the usual bills and advertisements was an envelope addressed to Patterson and Son Architects in elegant script. She carried it to Michael, who was just finishing his work in the garden. "Looks like you have another client," she said, settling back into her porch chair with the rest of the mail. Michael wiped his hands on a towel and tore open the envelope. Inside was a letter from the Millbrook Valley Historical Society, requesting his services to restore the old courthouse that had stood at the heart of the town for nearly 2 centuries. "They want me to bring the courthouse back to its original glory," he told Eleanor, unable to keep the excitement out of his voice. "It would be the biggest project I've undertaken since moving back." Eleanor smiled, watching the play of late afternoon sunlight through the oak trees that had sheltered their home for generations. "Your father would be proud," she said quietly. "He always said this town was worth preserving." Michael looked at his mother, really looked at her, and saw not the broken woman he'd found 6 months ago, but the strong, determined person who'd raised him with such fierce love. The gold light of evening painted everything with warmth, and in that moment Michael understood that he'd finally come home. Not just to a place, but to the person who mattered most. "We're going to be okay, aren't we, Mama?" he asked. Eleanor reached over and patted his hand, her touch warm and sure. "Better than okay, son. We're going to be family again. Thank you for listening to this story until the end. If you enjoyed it, please support the channel. Subscribe, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments so you don't miss the next episodes. See you in the next story.